Sometimes the smallest person carries the biggest fire inside them. When powerful people think they can crush someone just because they live in a simple shack, they forget one important truth. A woman with nothing left to lose becomes the most dangerous force on earth. What happened in the quiet hills of rural Tennessee proves that revenge isn't always served cold. Sometimes it burns everything to the ground before sunrise. Maria Elena Vasquez had lived in the same wooden shack for 37 years. The small structure sat on the edge of Millfield County, Tennessee, where the rolling hills met the forest line. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered gray boards, a tin roof that sang in the rain, and a front porch that sagged slightly on one corner. But inside those four walls lived a lifetime of memories, dreams, and everything Maria held sacred. She had moved there as a young bride in 1987 with her husband, Roberto. They were immigrants from Honduras who had scraped together every penny to buy the small plot of land from old Mr. Henderson. The property came with water rights to the creek that ran behind the house, something that would become incredibly important decades later. Roberto worked construction during the day and helped Maria tend their small garden in the evenings. They grew tomatoes, peppers, beans, and corn. Maria sold vegetables at the local farmers market every Saturday, her broken English improving week by week as she chatted with customers who became friends. The young couple dreamed of expanding their little farm, maybe getting some chickens, perhaps even a cow someday. Those dreams shifted when their daughter Carmen was born. The shack suddenly felt perfect, cozy and safe. Maria painted the walls bright yellow and hung curtains she sewed herself. Roberto built shelves for Carmen's books and toys. They added a small bedroom by enclosing part of the back porch. Every improvement was done with their own hands and paid for with money saved penny by penny. Tragedy struck when Carmen was 15. Roberto suffered a heart attack while working on a construction site. He was only 42 years old. Maria found herself alone with a teenager, a mortgage, and no idea how to survive. But Maria Vasquez was made of stronger stuff than people realized. She took over Roberto's vegetable garden and expanded it. She learned to fix things around the house herself, watching YouTube videos and asking for help at the hardware store. She cleaned houses for wealthy families in town, walking 2 miles each way when her old car broke down. Carmen excelled in school and earned a scholarship to college, making her mother prouder than any material success ever could. For 20 years after Roberto's death, Maria lived quietly in her shack. She became known in the community as the woman who could grow anything and fix anything. Neighbors brought her broken appliances and sick plants. She never charged much, often accepting payment in the form of a hot meal or help with grocery shopping. The trouble began in early 2024 when Millfield Development Corporation started buying land in the area. They had plans for a luxury housing development called Creekside Estates. The company was owned by 3 partners: Richard Blackwood, a real estate mogul from Nashville, Jennifer Price, a local politician's daughter, and Michael Torres, who ironically shared Maria's Hispanic heritage but had long since abandoned any connection to his roots. At first, they approached landowners with reasonable offers. Many of Maria's neighbors accepted the money and moved to more modern homes in town. But as the development took shape around her, Maria's small property became a problem. Her shack sat right in the middle of what was supposed to be the development's crown jewel: luxury homes overlooking the creek. The developer's first offer was $15,000. Maria politely declined. She explained through her friend Carmen, who had become a successful nurse and often translated for her mother, that the house held too many memories to sell. The offer increased to $25,000, then $40,000. Each time Maria's answer remained the same. Richard Blackwood grew impatient. He was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and this elderly Hispanic woman living in a shack was holding up his multi-million-dollar project. He began researching ways. What he discovered made him smile. Maria's property taxes hadn't been updated in decades, and the water rights documentation was old and potentially challengeable. The harassment started small. City inspectors began showing up at Maria's door, claiming they had received complaints about her property. They cited her for having too many chickens, even though she only had 4 and the legal limit was 6. They said her vegetable garden extended beyond her property line, though she had the survey documents to prove otherwise. Each citation came with a fine that ate away at Maria's limited savings. Jennifer Price used her political connections to get the property rezoned. Suddenly, Maria's agricultural land was classified as residential, meaning she couldn't legally sell vegetables from her garden anymore. This eliminated her primary source of income. When Maria tried to fight the rezoning at city council meetings, She was dismissed as a confused old woman who didn't understand progress. Michael Torres took a more personal approach. He began spreading rumors in the Hispanic community that Maria was making them all look bad by living in such poor conditions. He suggested she was too proud to accept help and too stubborn to see reason. Some of Maria's friends began to distance themselves, believing Torres's lies about her being difficult and ungrateful. The psychological pressure intensified as construction began around her property. Giant machines worked from dawn to dusk, filling the air with dust and noise. Workers were instructed to make as much commotion as possible near Maria's property line. Her well water became contaminated with construction runoff, forcing her to buy bottled water she couldn't afford. Maria's health began to deteriorate under the stress. She developed severe headaches and had trouble sleeping due to the constant noise. Her blood pressure medication became more expensive, and she often had to choose between buying medicine or food. Carmen wanted her mother to move in with her family in the city, but Maria refused to abandon the home she and Roberto had built together. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in March 2024. Maria woke to find notices posted all around her property. The developers had convinced the county to declare her home a public nuisance. She had 30 days to bring the property up to modern building codes or face demolition. The estimated cost of the required improvements was over $50,000, money Maria could never hope to raise. Carmen hired a lawyer, but the legal system moved slowly while the 30-day deadline approached rapidly. The developers had spent months laying the groundwork for this moment, ensuring every legal avenue was blocked. They had judges who owed them favors, inspectors on their payroll, and politicians in their pockets. On the morning of the 29th day, Maria sat on her front porch watching the sunrise. She had spent the night going through photo albums and packing Roberto's belongings. Carmen had arranged for a moving truck to come that afternoon. After 37 years, Maria was finally accepting defeat. But defeat never came. Instead, at exactly 7:30 a.m., 3 bulldozers rolled onto her property without warning. Behind them came Richard Blackwood in his silver Mercedes, Jennifer Price in her white BMW, and Michael Torres in his black pickup truck. They parked at the edge of the property and watched as the machines surrounded Maria's shack. The foreman, a large man named Duke Thompson, approached the porch where Maria sat, frozen in shock. He avoided eye contact as he spoke. "Ma'am, you need to get out now. We're starting demolition in 5 minutes." Maria's mind went blank. This wasn't supposed to happen until tomorrow. She still had one more day. The legal papers clearly stated March 30th, and today was only March 29th. She tried to explain this to Thompson, but her English failed her in her panic. "I don't make the rules, Lady," Thompson said, his voice uncomfortable but firm. "This is the book, it's about history." She tried to explain this to Thompson, but her English failed her in her panic. "Boss says tear it down now, so that's what we do." Behind him, Richard Blackwood checked his expensive watch and called out, "Let's get this done, Duke. We're burning daylight." Maria ran inside to grab what she could, but there wasn't time. 37 years of life couldn't be packed in 5 minutes. She managed to snatch Roberto's picture from the mantel, Carmen's baby shoes from a shelf, and a small wooden cross Roberto had carved for their first anniversary. Her hands shook as she clutched these precious items. The bulldozers didn't wait. The first machine pushed against the back corner of the house while Maria was still inside grabbing her treasures. The walls groaned and began to buckle. Thompson had to physically pull Maria from the collapsing structure as she screamed Roberto's name. She watched from the road as the machines tore apart her life. The yellow walls she had painted when Carmen was born crumbled like old paper. The bedroom where she had nursed Roberto through his final illness disappeared under a pile of broken boards. The kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals for her family became nothing but splinters and dust. The developers stood beside their expensive cars, occasionally pointing and discussing their plans as if Maria wasn't there. They talked about how much better the view would be without the eyesore blocking it. Jennifer Price mentioned having a landscape designer come out to plan gardens for the luxury homes. Richard Blackwood made a phone call to his architect about moving forward with the next phase of construction. In less than 2 hours, everything was gone. The bulldozers had reduced Maria's shack to a pile of broken wood and scattered belongings. They loaded the debris into dump trucks and hauled it away, leaving behind only bare earth and the concrete foundation that Roberto had poured with his own hands all those years ago. Maria stood alone on the empty lot as the machines drove away. The developers had already left in their luxury cars, probably heading to a celebration lunch. The silence was deafening after hours of mechanical noise and destruction. Carmen arrived 30 minutes later to find her mother sitting on the concrete steps that led to nothing, the moving truck she had arranged. Pulled up behind her car, but there was nothing left to move. The driver took one look at the empty lot and quietly left without saying a word. "Mama," Carmen whispered, kneeling beside her mother. "I'm so sorry. We'll fight this. We'll make them pay." But Maria didn't respond. She stared at the empty space where her home had been, still clutching Roberto's photograph and their daughter's baby shoes. Somewhere in the pile of debris that had already been hauled away were decades of Christmas decorations, birthday cards, report cards, wedding photos, and countless other irreplaceable memories. The developers had made a crucial mistake that day. They had assumed Maria Vasquez was just another elderly woman who would quietly disappear after being defeated. They had calculated the cost of destroying her home, but they had never calculated the cost of awakening something inside her that had been sleeping for 20 years. As the sun began to set on the empty lot where her shack once stood, Maria finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady, and Carmen had to lean close to hear the words. "They think they have won," Maria said in Spanish, her eyes never leaving the bare ground. "But they do not know what they have started." That night Maria didn't cry. She didn't rage or scream or fall apart as Carmen expected. Instead, she sat in Carmen's guest bedroom and began making phone calls. She called every neighbor who had been forced to sell their land. She called every worker who had been mistreated by the development company. She called every person in the Hispanic community who had been insulted by Michael Torres's comments about her. By midnight, Maria had filled a notebook with names, phone numbers, and stories. Tales of bribes and threats, of families forced from their homes, of workers cheated out of wages, of environmental damage covered up by politicians. The developers had left a trail of destruction that stretched far beyond Maria's small shack. As dawn approached, Maria closed her notebook and finally allowed herself to rest. But sleep didn't bring peace. Instead, it brought dreams of Roberto, standing in their destroyed garden, telling her that some fights are worth everything you have to give. She woke with absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. The developers had spent months planning her destruction. Now it was time for her to plan theirs. Maria woke before dawn with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Roberto's death. The guest bedroom at Carmen's house felt foreign and temporary, but her mind was sharp and focused. She dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Carmen already awake, staring into a cup of cold coffee. "Couldn't sleep either," Carmen said softly. "Mama, we need to call the lawyer again. What they did yesterday was illegal. They violated the demolition date by a full day." Maria poured herself coffee and sat across from her daughter. "The lawyers will take months, mija. By then, they will have built their houses and moved on to destroy someone else's life. This requires a different kind of justice." Something in her mother's tone made Carmen look up sharply. Maria's eyes held a determination that reminded Carmen of the woman who had rebuilt their lives after Roberto died. But there was something else there, too. Something that made Carmen slightly uneasy. "What are you thinking, Mama?" Maria pulled out the notebook she had filled the night before. "I am thinking that these three people have hurt many families, not just ours. I am thinking that they believe they can do whatever they want because they have money and connections. And I am thinking that they are about to learn how wrong they are." Over the next several days, Maria began implementing a plan that was both methodical and audacious. Her first step was research. Not the kind done in law libraries, but the kind done in coffee shops, beauty salons, and grocery store parking lots. She became a detective, gathering information about Richard Blackwood, Jennifer Price, and Michael Torres. What she discovered was a web of corruption and cruelty that stretched back years. Richard Blackwood had built his fortune by forcing elderly landowners from their properties through intimidation and legal manipulation. He had a pattern of arriving just before demolition deadlines, taking personal satisfaction in watching families lose their homes. His ex-wife had divorced him after discovering he kept photographs of demolished houses in his office like trophies. Jennifer Price had used her father's political connections to fast-track development projects that destroyed wetlands and polluted water sources. She lived in a mansion built on land that had once housed a historic African-American cemetery. The graves relocated with minimal ceremony to make room for her tennis court. Local environmental groups had been trying to build cases against her for years, but witnesses had a habit of changing their stories or disappearing entirely. Michael Torres was perhaps the most despicable of the three. He specifically targeted Hispanic families, using his shared heritage to gain their trust before betraying them. He would promise fair deals and legal assistance, then structure contracts that left families homeless and in debt. He had built his reputation in the Hispanic community as a success story, someone who had made it, all while systematically destroying the lives of people who looked up to him. But Maria's research went deeper than just their business practices. She learned their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. Richard Blackwood was terrified of public humiliation and had spent years crafting an image as a philanthropist and community leader. Jennifer Price was obsessed with her political future and her family's legacy. Michael Torres was desperate to be accepted by wealthy white society and would do anything to maintain his status. Armed with this knowledge, Maria began phase 2 of her plan, building a network. She reached out to every family that had been forced from their land, every worker who had been cheated, every person who had been hurt by Millfield Development Corporation. What she found was a community of people hungry for justice but lacking the knowledge or resources to fight back. Maria's first ally was unexpected. Thompson appeared at Carmen's front door on a Thursday evening, holding his hat in his hands and looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Bastrov Hire. Vasquez," he said when Maria answered the door. "I need to talk to you about what happened at your place." Maria invited him in, and Thompson's story poured out. He explained that Blackwood had specifically ordered him to begin demolition a day early, knowing it was illegal. When Thompson had protested, Blackwood had threatened to fire him and blacklist him from every construction job in the county. Thompson had a sick wife and 2 kids in college. He couldn't afford to lose his job. "But I can't sleep at night," Thompson said, his voice breaking. "What we did to you, it ain't right. I've been thinking about quitting, but that won't help you get your house back." Maria leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. "What would help, Mr. Thompson?" Thompson shifted nervously. "Well, I still work for them. I hear things. I see things. And I got access to places and information that might be useful if someone was planning to, I don't know, set things right." This was the moment Maria had been waiting for, an inside source with both access and motivation. She studied Thompson's face, seeing genuine remorse and a desire for redemption. After a long moment, she nodded. "Tell me about their security systems." Thompson's eyes widened slightly, but he answered, "Motion sensors on all the buildings, cameras at the main entrances. But the construction sites? Those are wide open at night. Nobody expects trouble from a bunch of dirt and lumber." Maria's next recruit was Rosa Martinez, a former cleaning lady who had worked for Jennifer Price until she was fired for accidentally overhearing a phone conversation about bribing a city inspector. Rosa was bitter and angry, with detailed knowledge of Price's home layout, schedule, and personal secrets. "That woman thinks she's so perfect," Rosa spat during a meeting in Maria's new temporary apartment. "But I know where she keeps her real files, the ones her lawyer doesn't know about. I know about her drinking problem and her gambling debts. I know things that would destroy her precious reputation." The network grew slowly but steadily. There was Carlos Restrepo, whose family farm had been seized through eminent domain abuse orchestrated by the developers. He brought knowledge of legal loopholes and connections in the immigrant community. There was Sarah Chen, an environmental scientist who had been silenced when she tried to report illegal dumping at the construction sites. She offered technical expertise and contacts in the media. Perhaps most importantly, there was Father Miguel Santos from St. Teresa's Catholic Church. The elderly priest had watched his parish shrink as families were forced from their homes by developers. He didn't explicitly endorse Maria's plans, but he offered his church as a meeting place and his moral authority as cover for their activities. As autumn arrived, Maria's plan began to take concrete shape. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about justice, exposure, and making the developers face the same fear and helplessness they had inflicted on others. The first phase would target their finances. Sarah Chen had discovered that Millfield Development Corporation was operating with massive debt, using fraudulent environmental impact reports to secure loans they couldn't repay. If this information reached the right banks and regulatory agencies at the right time, it would trigger investigations that could freeze their assets and halt construction. The second phase would expose their corruption. Rosa had photographed documents proving Price's bribery schemes, while Thompson had recorded conversations between Blackwood and city officials discussing illegal demolition orders. Carlos had gathered testimony from dozens of families who had been cheated or threatened. The third phase was the most dangerous, a coordinated action that would force all 3 developers to experience the same helplessness and violation they had inflicted on their victims. Maria was still working out the details, but the basic concept was clear. They would wake up one morning to find their comfortable, powerful lives completely dismantled, just as she had watched her home be destroyed. But Maria knew that successful revenge required perfect timing and flawless execution. The developers had to be hit simultaneously, with no chance to warn each other or escape consequences. Every detail had to be planned, every contingency anticipated. She spent weeks studying their schedules, learning their routines. Richard Blackwood worked late every Tuesday, staying in his office until nearly midnight to review financial reports. Jennifer Price attended a weekly poker game every Thursday at a private club, returning home drunk around 2 a.m. Michael Torres had a standing appointment with his personal trainer every Friday morning at 6 a.m. The construction sites followed predictable patterns too. Security guards made rounds every 2 hours but spent most of their time in the trailer watching television. The luxury homes under construction were at various stages of completion, with several nearly finished and others still just framing. Maria also began gathering materials and tools. Thompson provided access to construction equipment and knowledge of how to operate it. So, Carlos brought friends who were skilled in electronics and security systems. Rosa contributed her knowledge of the developer's personal vulnerabilities and schedules. But the most important element of Maria's plan was psychological. She understood that these three people had spent years believing they were untouchable, that money and connections made them immune to consequences. The shock of suddenly finding themselves vulnerable and powerless would be more devastating than any financial loss. As December approached, Maria set the date for her counterattack, Christmas Eve morning, when the developers would be focused on holiday celebrations and least likely to expect trouble. It was also symbolically perfect, a time when thoughts should turn to peace and forgiveness, but when Maria would finally balance the scales of justice. The irony wasn't lost on her. While her enemies planned holiday parties in the luxury homes built on stolen land, she would give them a Christmas morning they would never forget. Maria's network had grown to include over 30 people, all connected by their shared experience of being victimized by Millfield Development Corporation. They met in small groups at different locations, sometimes in Father Miguel's church basement, sometimes in the back room of Carlos's cousin's restaurant, sometimes in the parking lot of the abandoned factory where many of them had once worked. Some would handle communications, ensuring that evidence reached the right journalists and government officials at precisely the right moment. Others would document everything, creating an unshakable record of the developer's crimes. Still others would carry out the direct actions that would leave the three partners feeling as violated and helpless as their victims had felt. But Maria kept the most important elements of the plan to herself. She had learned from her enemy's mistake. They had underestimated her because they thought they understood her. She wouldn't make the same error in reverse. As Christmas approached, Maria could feel the tension building among her network. People were nervous about the risks they were taking, worried about legal consequences, scared of retaliation, but they were also excited. For the first time in years, they felt like they had power, like they could fight back against the forces that had crushed them. Maria spent her days making final preparations, and her nights lying awake, thinking about Roberto. She could almost feel his presence in those quiet hours, could almost hear his voice whispering encouragement. This wasn't just about her shack anymore. It was about every family that had been destroyed, every dream that had been crushed, every person who had been told they didn't matter. On December 23rd, Maria received the final piece of information she needed. Thompson called with news that all three developers would be in town for Christmas, each following their usual routines. The construction sites would be minimally guarded due to the holiday. Most importantly, the timing was perfect for maximum impact, with minimal chance of anyone getting physically hurt. That evening, Maria gathered her core team for the final briefing. They met in the church basement, surrounded by Christmas decorations that seemed oddly appropriate for what they were planning. As Maria outlined the last details of their plan, she saw a mixture of excitement and fear on the faces around her. "Are you sure about this, Maria?" asked Sarah Chen. "Once we start, there's no going back. They'll know it was us." Maria nodded calmly. "Good. I want them to know. I want them to understand that their actions have consequences. I want them to realize that when you destroy someone's life, you create an enemy who has nothing left to lose." She looked around the room at the faces of people who had become more than allies. They had become family, bonded by shared suffering and common purpose. "Tomorrow morning, we remind three very powerful people that no one is untouchable. We show them what it feels like to wake up and find everything they care about has been destroyed while they slept." As the meeting broke up and people began heading home to spend Christmas Eve with their families, Maria remained behind in the empty church basement. She knelt before a small statue of the Virgin Mary and whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength to see her plan through to the end. Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the town in pristine white. By morning, That snow would be stained with the ashes of the developers' carefully constructed lives, and Maria Vasquez would finally have the justice that the legal system had denied her. The final phase of her plan was about to begin. Christmas Eve dawned crisp and clear, with fresh snow covering the construction sites of Creekside Estates. Maria woke at 4 a.m., her mind immediately sharp and focused, despite having slept only 3 hours. Today was the day she had planned for 9 months. The day Richard Blackwood, Jennifer Price, and Michael Torres would finally face consequences for their actions. She dressed in dark clothing and made coffee in Carmen's kitchen, moving quietly to avoid waking her daughter. Carmen had been increasingly worried about her mother's secretive activities, but Maria had kept the details of her plan hidden. Some burdens were too heavy to share, even with those you love most. At 4:30 a.m., Maria's phone buzzed with the first of several text messages. Phase 1 complete, packages delivered. Came from Sarah Chen. This meant the financial evidence had been simultaneously delivered to 3 major banks, 2 federal agencies, and 4 news organizations. By the time the business world reopened after Christmas, Millfield Development Corporation would be facing investigations that would freeze their assets and expose years of fraudulent activity. The next message came from Rosa Martinez. Gift wrapping finished. This was the code indicating that Jennifer Price's illegal activities were now documented and ready for public release. Rosa had spent the previous evening using her key to Price's house, a key she had kept from her cleaning days, to photograph the hidden files that detailed years of bribery, environmental law violations, and illegal campaign contributions. But the messages were just the beginning. Maria's real work would start at dawn. At 5 a.m., Maria met Thompson and Carlos at a predetermined location, an abandoned gas station 3 miles from the construction site. The 2 men looked nervous but determined. Thompson had brought bolt cutters and master keys for the construction equipment. Carlos had a laptop loaded with software that could hack into security systems and communication networks. "You sure about this, Mrs. Vasquez?" Thompson asked one final time. "Once we start those machines, there's no hiding who did this." Maria's eyes were steady and calm. "I am not hiding, Mr. Thompson. I want them to know exactly who destroyed their dreams while they slept peacefully in their beds." The first target was the construction site itself, specifically the 5 luxury homes that were nearly completed and scheduled to be sold within weeks. These houses sat on land that had been stolen from families like Maria's, built with money obtained through fraud and corruption. They represented everything wrong with Millfield Development Corporation. Using Thompson's keys, the team accessed the heavy machinery that sat idle for the holiday. Maria had spent weeks learning to operate a bulldozer, practicing in secret at Carlos's friend's junkyard. Her movements were careful but confident as she started the massive machine and drove it toward the first house. The irony was perfect. She was using the same type of machine that had destroyed her shack to destroy their profit centers. The bulldozer's blade cut through luxury siding and custom windows like they were made of paper. Within minutes, the first house was reduced to expensive rubble. But Maria wasn't finished. She moved systematically from house to house, demolishing each structure with the same ruthless efficiency the developers had shown when destroying her home. Thompson and Carlos worked alongside her, using excavators to tear apart foundations and dump trucks to create barriers that would prevent quick cleanup. The destruction was thorough and methodical. Swimming pools were filled with debris. Landscaped yards were torn up and replanted with construction waste. The sales office, with its glossy brochures and scale models, was reduced to splinters. Even the sign announcing Creekside Estates luxury living was torn down and buried under a pile of broken concrete. As the sun rose higher, Phase 2 of Maria's plan activated automatically. Carlos's laptop program sent a coordinated release of information to every major news outlet in Tennessee. Photos of the bribery documents Rosa had copied were simultaneously posted to social media accounts that had been created months earlier. Video recordings of Blackwood giving illegal demolition orders were uploaded to YouTube channels with thousands of subscribers. But the digital exposure was paired with physical evidence. At exactly 7 a.m., while the developers were still sleeping off their Christmas Eve celebrations, packages were delivered to their homes. Each package contained copies of all the evidence that had been gathered against them, along with a simple note: "You destroyed my home while I watched. Now you know how it feels." Maria Vasquez. Richard Blackwood was the first to receive his package. He was drinking coffee in his luxury kitchen when his doorbell rang. The delivery driver handed him a thick envelope marked "Urgent Personal" and left without waiting for a signature. Inside, Blackwood found photographs of himself taking bribes, copies of forged environmental reports with his signature, and bank records showing fraudulent loan applications. But the documents were just the appetizer. As Blackwood frantically flipped through the evidence, his phone began ringing with calls from reporters, federal investigators, and bank executives. The financial world was already buzzing with news about Millfield Development Corporation's fraudulent activities. By 8 a.m., trading in the company's stock had been halted pending investigation. Jennifer Price discovered her package when she stumbled home from her Thursday night poker game, still drunk and disoriented. She initially ignored the envelope, but when her phone started ringing with calls from political reporters and ethics investigators, she sobered up quickly. The documents in her package included photos of her secret files, recordings of bribery conversations, and evidence of environmental crimes that carried potential prison sentences. Price's political career died that morning. By 9 a.m., her father had issued a statement distancing himself from her activities. By 10 a.m., 3 federal agencies had announced investigations into her conduct. By noon, her law license had been suspended pending review. Michael Torres received his package at the gym, where his personal trainer handed it to him during their regular Friday morning session. Torres initially laughed, thinking it was some kind of Christmas prank. His laughter died when he opened the envelope and found evidence of every family he had cheated, every worker he had betrayed, every lie he had told to build his fortune. The reaction from the Hispanic community was swift and brutal. Torres had built his reputation as a success story, a man who had made it in America while staying true to his roots. The revelation that he had systematically destroyed Hispanic families for profit triggered outrage that spread through social media and community organizations within hours. But Maria's plan had one final phase, the most personal and devastating element of her revenge. At 10 a.m., while the 3 developers were dealing with the collapse of their professional lives, Maria and her team arrived at each of their homes. They came not as criminals or vandals, but as a community demanding justice. Richard Blackwood's mansion was surrounded by dozens of families carrying signs with photos of their demolished homes. They stood silently in his front yard, a living reminder of everyone he had hurt. When Blackwood looked out his windows, he saw the faces of every person whose life he had destroyed for profit. The crowd included elderly couples who had lost homes they'd lived in for decades, young families who had been forced into homelessness, children who had watched their bedrooms torn down by bulldozers. They didn't threaten or shout, they simply stood there, making Blackwood confront the human cost of his greed.
At Jennifer Price's house, environmental activists had gathered with displays showing the ecological damage caused by her illegal development projects.
Photos of polluted streams, destroyed wetlands, and contaminated soil covered her perfectly manicured lawn. Scientists presented evidence of health problems in communities affected by her projects. Michael Torres faced perhaps the most devastating judgment of all. Members of the Hispanic community, many wearing traditional clothing and carrying flags from their countries of origin, gathered outside his home to perform a symbolic ritual. They had brought copies of every fraudulent contract Torres had used to steal from immigrant families, and they'd burned them in a ceremonial fire while speaking the names of every family he had betrayed. But Maria's personal confrontation was reserved for the construction site itself. At 11 a.m., she stood in the middle of the destruction she had created, surrounded by the rubble of 5 luxury homes. When the 3 developers finally arrived, alerted by frantic calls from security guards, they found her waiting for them. Richard Blackwood climbed out of his Mercedes, his face purple with rage. "You crazy old woman. Do you have any idea what you've done? This is millions of dollars in damage." "I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you have." Maria stood calmly among the debris, unmoved by his fury. "I have nothing for you to take, Mr. Blackwood. You already destroyed everything I owned. But now you know how it feels to watch your dreams turned into rubble, while you stand helplessly by." Jennifer Price was weeping, her political career and reputation in ruins.
"This is insane."
"You've destroyed all of us over one stupid shack. It wasn't even worth $15,000. Maria's eyes flashed with cold fire. "That shack was worth everything to me. It was my life with Roberto. My memories of raising Carmen, 37 years of building something beautiful from nothing. You destroyed it without a thought because you believed I was powerless. Today you learn that no one is powerless when they have nothing left to lose." Michael Torres tried a different approach, speaking to Maria in Spanish and appealing to their shared heritage. He claimed he had been trying to help her, that he understood her struggle as a fellow immigrant. Maria's response came in English, clear and strong.
"Do not speak to me about being an immigrant, Mr.
Torres. You are no longer one of us. You sold your soul to destroy your own people. That makes you worse than them. At least they never pretended to be our friend." As police sirens grew closer, Maria's supporters began to arrive. Dozens of families who had been victims of Millfield Development Corporation came to stand with her. They formed a protective circle around the small woman who had finally given them justice. The media arrived simultaneously, drawn by the spectacular story of an elderly woman's perfect revenge. News vans surrounded the construction site as reporters scrambled to capture the dramatic confrontation. The images would lead every newscast that evening. Maria standing calmly in the center of the destruction while three powerful people raged helplessly around her. When the police finally arrived, they found a complex situation. Technically, Maria and her team had committed serious crimes: destruction of property, trespassing, theft of construction equipment. But they had also exposed even more serious crimes committed by the developers. The evidence of bribery, fraud, and illegal demolitions couldn't be ignored. Maria made no attempt to flee or deny her actions. When Detective Sarah Williams approached her, Maria held out her hands for handcuffs. "I am ready to accept the consequences of my actions, Detective, but I want you to know that everything I did was in response to crimes committed against me and dozens of other families." The arrest became a media spectacle. As Maria was led away in handcuffs, the crowd of supporters began chanting her name. "Maria, Maria, Maria." The chant was picked up by people watching on social media, spreading across the country as news of her story went viral. But Maria's final victory came in the months that followed her arrest. The evidence she had gathered led to federal investigations that resulted in serious criminal charges against all three developers. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and racketeering. Jennifer Price received 6 years for bribery and environmental crimes. Michael Torres got 10 years for targeting immigrant communities and organized fraud schemes. More importantly, the investigations led to wider reforms. Laws were changed to prevent the kind of illegal demolitions that had destroyed Maria's home. Environmental protections were strengthened. A victim compensation fund was established using assets seized from Millfield Development Corporation. Maria herself served 18 months in minimum security prison, but her time behind bars only increased her legendary status. She received thousands of letters of support from people around the world who admired her courage. Legal defense funds raised enough money to pay her fines and provide her with a comfortable retirement. When Maria was released, she found that Carmen had used some of the donated money to purchase land near the original site of their family shack. A new house had been built there. Not a mansion, but a comfortable home surrounded by a garden where Maria could grow vegetables again. The property included a memorial garden dedicated to Roberto and all the other people whose homes had been destroyed by predatory developers. A simple granite stone marked the spot where the original shack had stood, with an inscription in both English and Spanish. "Home is not a place that can be taken by force. Home is love that lives forever in the heart." On the first anniversary of her Christmas Eve revenge, Maria held a celebration at her new home. Hundreds of people came, families who had been helped by the Victim Compensation Fund, environmental activists who had benefited from the new protection laws, immigrants who had found hope in Maria's story. As the sun set over the gathering, Maria stood in her garden and thought about Roberto. She could feel his pride in what she had accomplished, not just for herself, but for all the powerless people who had been given hope by her actions. The developers had thought they could destroy her because she was just one small woman living in a simple shack. They had learned too late that the smallest person can carry the biggest fire, and that fire, once ignited, can burn down empires built on cruelty and greed. Maria Vasquez had settled the score not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. In destroying her home, the developers had awakened something they could never control: the righteous fury of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The shack was gone, but the woman who had lived in it had become something much more powerful, a symbol of resistance, a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and proof that sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply giving people exactly what they deserve.